Okay, thanks everyone for joining us today. I'm Annalyn Bergen. I'm the compliance lead for the Clean Buildings team. Today's presentations is on decarbonization of district energy systems. Your presenters are myself, Luke, Donnie, and James. For support, you'll have Judy entering some helpful links in the chat. Dylan is presenting. He's also going to be moderating some questions a little later on and as we go through the presentation. Judy, if you can enter the link to the presentation in the chat so people can follow along and kind of navigate at their own pace, read it at their own pace, because there's going to be a lot of information. So next slide, please. So the Washington State Department of Commerce exists to help strengthen communities across the state. There's about 150 different programs that the agency offers, in addition to all sorts of technical assistance that we provide. So our program sits within the energy division. Across Commerce, we collaborate quite a bit with other folks on economic development, on infrastructure and housing. So next slide, please. So I just want to do a brief introduction to our building performance staff. Here you have Josette, Derek, and Brittany with the incentive team. Then you have KJ and Michael working on data. Luke, Donnie, Judy, and James provides technical support. Myself, Dylan, and Jeff for outreach, education, and compliance. If you followed us from the beginning, you know we've grown significantly over the years. We're almost fully staffed. Our entire team is dedicated to providing timely, actionable, and clear information about the Clean Buildings Performance Standard. So next slide. Oh, here. The agenda. So for part one of this series, we'll focus on some general overview, talk about the components of a decarb plan, how it all works with the other requirements of the performance standard, the timeline. We'll talk about benchmarking a campus, calculating and how to calculate an EUIt for it, and what the reporting for tier 1 and tier 2 requirements looks like through the Decarb plan. We've not developed the agenda for part 2 yet. If there's a specific topic that we don't go over and you want us to go more in depth with something, let us know. Or if there's a scenario you'd like us to kind of address, at the end of the presentation, I'm going to open up the floor. You can put it in the chat, and then we can incorporate it into our part 2 agenda. Next slide, please. So allow me to give you just a brief overview of how we got here. So House Bill 1390 was introduced in the 2023 legislative session. The bill expanded the Clean Buildings Performance Standard to decarbonization of district energy systems. At the beginning of this year, 2024, we started our rulemaking workshops. Some of you may have attended. We had 4 in total. So we recently filed our CR 103. This is kind of the final step in the whole rulemaking process. It finalizes the rules, and then the rules are then added to the Washington Administrative Code. The Clean Buildings Performance Standard is based on ASHRAE Standard 100, which covers energy efficiency in existing buildings. So this is the reference standard. Commerce developed amendments to the standard to conform to the legislation. These amendments can be found under WAC 19450. We're updating that integrated document that's on our that you would download from our website with these new rules regarding the decarbonization of district energy systems. We hope to have that available to you by the end of the summer. You can find the current integrated document, which was published in February 2024, with the new rules with the tier 2 incorporated into it. So that link is on our website. You know, as I go through everything I'm speaking about, Judy's putting the links in the chat if you want to check those out, including past workshops of House Bill 1390 rulemaking. So the decarbonization of district energy system requirements are mandatory for state campus district energy systems and optional for campus district energy systems. We're going to go over kind of the differences in a couple of slides and in more detail. So regarding registering and opting in to these rules, extend the compliance for tier 1 and tier 2 for up to 15 years. So what's our role at Commerce? Commerce was charged with rulemaking, reviewing and approving decarbonization plans, providing a summary report to the governor and the legislature, and supporting mandatory compliance. So next slide, please. So this is the breakdown of the Clean Buildings Performance Standard by section. The standard is comprised of Standard 100, as I mentioned before, and the latest version is from February 2024. Soon you'll see a new version. If you want to know right away, I'm sure I'll send an email to the registrants of these training, but if you can also check in on our website, or you can subscribe to our bulletin, which will announce it. The standard will be free of charge. As it has always been, you just have to fill out a form to download the document. Next slide, please. And as I mentioned before, like these new rules applies to state campus district energy systems and campus district energy system. One is mandatory, the other is optional. The state campus district, just keep in mind that the state campus and district energy system it's 5 buildings or more. So they're defined a little differently. Both of them is 100,000 combined square feet of floor area. But the number count for each one is different, and the ownership as well. In a couple slides, you're going to see kind of a more in-depth definition of it. And then you could read it at your own pace by downloading the slides. And Judy put the link in the chat. So next slide, please. So I won't go over these terms and details. They can, you could read them and you could read them as we go through the presentation. We're trying to be very careful using the appropriate terms as they are defined in standard. You'll see them kind of italicized, sprinkled throughout the integrated document. Certain terms were defined by the legislature, such as campus. So you see that we weren't able to make those changes during rulemaking. So next slide, please. And as you can see here, the definition for the campus district energy system and the state campus district energy system, super long, super detailed. Please download the slides using the link provided in the chat. Kind of read it at your own pace so you could kind of see the details of it all. I'm going to pass on the presentation to Luke. Next slide, please.
Good morning, folks. Thanks for joining us today. I am going to turn my camera off to save bandwidth. I've been having a little connection issues today. If at any point, Dylan, you find me with connection issues, just let me know. All right, go ahead and go to the next slide, Dylan. So, the whole purpose behind House Bill 1390 is to replace fossil fuels in our district energy systems, heating plants. Go ahead, yeah, there we go. So, as Annalyn spoke of in the previous slides, there is a definition for state campus as well as campus. Again, state campus, 5 buildings or more with 100,000 square feet of aggregate gross floor area or more. State campuses are required to comply with this standard. Campuses can opt in and choose to comply through Annex W, is what we'll refer to the House Bill 1390 decarbonization requirements. So again, the big driver here is to decarbonize the heating plant in a district energy system. If you have a state campus that has cooling only district energy system, you still have to comply with Annex W of the standard, but obviously since you don't have a heating plant that's connected to a district energy, as part of a district energy system, you wouldn't need to decarbonize that. You can, excuse me? Okay. So you can choose to decarbonize your campus. Let's say you have a cooling only district energy system. You can choose to decarbonize your heating systems that are distributed throughout the campus. If you do elect to do that, you are able to gain some extra time for compliance with the Clean Building Performance Standard, so up to 15 years plus. Next slide, please. The provisions of Annex W, or the requirements for decarbonization, do allow a certain percentage, up to 10% of fossil fuel or electric resistance heat sources for that district energy system. This is designed to be kind of backup, extreme weather, so on and so forth. The decarbonization of the district heating system is needing to be designed so they can meet the full design load for that district energy system, but we do allow some backup. And if you are complying through, there is a pathway, which we'll talk more detail about here in a couple slides, for decarbonizing the campus heating systems at the building level. That same 10% limit also applies to that strategy. Next slide. So during the rulemaking process, we did take public comment, and one of the comments was decommissioning of a district energy system heating plant. There may be instances where it is more cost effective and saves more energy to decommission a district energy system. In those cases, we do have specific provisions outlined for that. So that is an option. Next, Dylan. A little more detail about that. You will find the specifics of this in normative Annex W under section W 3.1.11 A and B. Again, you're going to be required to do a life cycle cost analysis to verify that it is the most cost effective and most cost-effective mechanism to decarbonizing that campus and lead to greater energy savings. Next slide. Oops, I want to go back on that. And so there is a little bit, if you are abandoning a district energy system, part of the requirements is to evaluate potential other uses, cost-effective uses of that distribution system that you're abandoning. So it basically assures that you're evaluating the decommissioning appropriately and not leaving some beneficial, cost-effective attributes of that system and abandoning that. Next slide. So one thing that's important with these decarbonization plans is to evaluate the possible options to partner with nearby sources of waste heat or cooling. So with these decarbonization plans need to be in depth enough to consider those benefits. So there could be adjacent sewer systems that you can get some waste heat recovery, data centers, etc. Next slide. Additionally, examination of opportunities to expand the district energy system so that neighboring buildings can reap the benefits of the decarbonized system. This could be buildings owned by the the district energy system owner, or the buildings that are served by the district energy system, or it can be buildings of different ownership. So there are some examples of plans out there in the state right now doing such. Again, some of these requirements are mandatory requirements, such as decarbonizing the district energy system heating plant. Some of them are examinations, evaluations, and so forth. So it's something that you need to look at when developing these plans. They're not necessarily going to be required for every plan, but if it's deemed to be uh, an effective measure, we do want to see that in the decarbonization plans. Next slide. Okay, so in addition to decarbonizing the heating plant and evaluating the other items that we've covered, you still need to meet the clean building performance standards performance metrics. So that could either be the energy use intensity target at the campus level, or the investment criteria, the standard. So we imagine that most folks are going to be pursuing compliance through the performance or through the energy use intensity target. The investment criteria for an entire campus would require a level 2 energy audit on all tier 1 buildings and implementation of all energy efficiency measures at the building level deemed to be cost effective in accordance with the life cycle cost analysis criteria of Annex X of the standard. So, to be fully transparent there, it may be a little bit of a bigger task to pursue the investment criteria at the campus level, but that is an option. Next slide. So in addition to meeting the performance metric, either at EUIt or investment criteria, you do need to implement all the EM energy management plan requirements and the operations and maintenance program on all buildings connected to the campus. So not just the tier 1 and the tier 2 buildings, but also any other buildings under 20,000 square feet. That EMP and O&M do need to cover those buildings as well. Advance slide, Dylan. Okay, we'll talk a little bit about the implementation schedule here in just a moment. Next slide.
Luke, just a second. I'm gonna pop a question in from the chat.
Great.
Ian had asked, this isn't for you. It got answered by both Annalyn and Judy, but for anyone who didn't catch it in the chat, although Ian asked that the opt-in for private systems date has passed, is that opt-in date up for review in ongoing rulemaking? Annalyn responded that rulemaking has concluded and we are allowing opt-in and registration no later than June 30th of 2025. So you can still opt in at this point. And Judy helpfully put in the link for opting in.
Yeah, thanks for clarifying that. And bring that up. It's a good question, Ian. Yeah, we understand the legislation says that we need opt-in needs to be identified by June of 2024. We at Congress, we recognize that that's a tight schedule for folks just seeing the decarbonization rules that were published, that it's doesn't give them enough time to determine whether they want to opt in. So we'll allow that till 2025. So thank you. And so, yeah, and I also saw, Jeanette, you had a question regarding just confirming that only one EMP and O&M is required as part of the Annex W or decarbonization planning. That is correct. So you do want that EMP and O&M. You only need one for the entire campus, but it does need to incorporate the attributes of all buildings connected to that district energy system. And that can be and I'll demonstrate in a minute here when we talk about the compliance schedule, that can be an iterative process. Any other questions, Dylan, that you want to handle now?
You can move forward.
Okay, great. Okay, so just to kind of reiterate some of these clean building, I'm gonna call Annex W the Decarb planning, and the rest of the standard just the CBPS, the Clean Building Performance Standard. We want to make sure that there's a plan scheduled out in the decarbonization plan for meeting these items. So such as the benchmarking requirements, the energy management plan, and the O&M program. And of course, meeting either the investment criteria or the energy use intensity target. Those requirements are required to be documented and submitted to Commerce by a qualified person, which is outlined in Section 3 of the standard. Qualified person is defined. Generally, it's going to be an architect or an engineer or someone with similar qualifications with 3 or more years of experience in energy efficiency in buildings. Next slide. So one of the advantages of the decarbonization plan is it does extend the compliance period for Tier 1 and Tier 2 buildings. So if you are required to decarbonize, comply through the decarbonization plan, or you opt in, you will get up to 15 years plus to meet the full standard. And that now the EMP and the O&M is expected to be implemented based on the original compliance schedules. Again, I'm going to give you a little more outline of how that works here in a couple slides. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is just a basic graphic representation of all we just spoke of. So you're going to need to benchmark the building, see where you're at, so that you can help develop a plan to meet the performance metric and include that in your decarbonization plan. So benchmarking will help inform which path you're going to take to meet the performance metric. The decarb plan is going to include all the details of how you're decarbonizing district energy system, as well as all the items that you need to evaluate. Next workshop here in a couple of weeks, we're going to hammer in on the details of what we're calling Form K, which is a outline of all the specific details that need to be included in the decarbonization plan. So expect us really getting into the details next workshop. And then we'll talk about what needs to be in that decarb plan. Again, you need to implement the O&M and EMP according to the standard and meet that performance metric. Next slide. Okay, so the timeline. This will help kind of outline how that EMP and O&M works out too. So rules are adopted here in 2024 this summer. So start your plan early. If you are either private or let's say a campus defined as a campus district energy system, which could be private. It could also be public of 3 buildings or more. You need to opt in this year prior to June 2025. And for the state campuses, you still need to send that information in. Judy, I'm not sure if you posted that smart sheet link, and I know that Jane's going to be talking about that here in a few slides, but we do have a specific form for notifying us of your campus. June 2025, we want to see that final plan. June of 2026 is when we first start implementing the energy management plan and operations and maintenance program on the biggest buildings. So again, it's iterative. We expect to see work towards an energy management plan and operations and maintenance program starting with the largest buildings so we can achieve those energy savings as soon as possible and in accordance with the original compliance schedule. For buildings between 90 and 220,000 square feet and all Tier 2 buildings, we're looking at June of 2027 for that to be implemented. 2028 will be for the smallest of Tier 1 buildings. Again, we know that things are going to change as time goes on, as you implement your decarbonization plan, so that energy management plan will evolve. We want you to focus on the things that are truly going to save energy and improve your operations and maintenance protocols for the entirety of the decarbonization plan. Prioritize those. If you're going to be decommissioning or abandoning equipment as that decarbonization plan gets implemented, we will expect you to evaluate that appropriately. You know, you don't necessarily need to have as robust of operations and maintenance on certain equipment that are going to be abandoned here and are part of your decarbonization plan to be decommissioned. So there, just keep in mind there is some flexibility there. June 2029, we don't really have any due dates in June of 2029, but progress reporting on the decarbonization plan is due in June of 2030. So we want to hear some progress on implementing the schedule that's part of the decarbonization plan, any changes to that plan. We also expect the EMP and O&M to be implemented on the remaining buildings that are not tier 1 or tier 2 by June of 2030. And again, the EMP and O&M should be updated annually according to changes in equipment, according to changes in occupation, control schedules, so on and so forth. EMP and O&M are kind of ongoing annual maintenance maintained throughout time. We don't need progress reporting every year on those. And then progress reporting is then every cycle until completion reporting. Completion reporting, it'd be 2040. Sometimes in some decarbonization plans, you may have it completed prior to 2040, and some we will approve to be beyond 2040. Thanks, Dylan. All right, I think Donnie's up next.
Thanks, Luke.
I don't know, Dylan, if we got any other questions to be fielded now, but.
There's one question in the chat. It's a little bit of a longer question, so I think we'll take that one at the end.
Thank you, Dylan.
All right, everybody, Donnie Westfall here. I'm just going to touch on some, kind of high-level benchmarking requirements, and then measuring EUI at the campus level and developing an EUI target. So next slide. So most of you are familiar with the benchmarking requirements for Clean Building Standard. Campuses complying through the Decarb of their district energy systems must still comply with the performance metric requirement of the Clean Building Standard. Part of that process is calculating an EUI for the building, or in this case, the aggregated EUI for a campus using 12 consecutive months of energy use data. And then how do we do it? We utilize Portfolio Manager to track building energy use and report EUI for compliance. Next slide. So Portfolio Manager offers a how-to document that walks through setting up a campus. This document kind of details the process to create a parent-child relationship so that individual buildings can be associated with a parent campus property. Judy can put a link in the chat that you can reference for that. In some instances, a user may have multiple parent-child relationships for the campus. For example, there may be a parent property for your district energy system and then the child properties associated with it. But if complying at, say, a campus level, those same child properties may be associated with a larger parent property, like a college or university. So it might account for some buildings on a college university campus that aren't necessarily connected to that district energy system, but are part of that compliance with the Clean Building Standard. Buildings without targets or individual exempt buildings that are part of the campus must be excluded from benchmarking and the campus EUI calculations. Next slide. So for campuses, benchmarking and EUI development will look a little different. As I just spoke to, the net energy use of the campus will need to account for all the buildings on the campus. And again, this may differ depending on the approach to compliance with the Clean Building Standard. Like I mentioned earlier, a campus pursuing decarb of their district energy system may comply as a connected building. If it's just the buildings that are connected to that district energy system, and that's all that's complying with the standard. But if they're complying at a campus level, such as college, university, K-12 schools, hospitals, and prisons, they may need to include energy use from buildings that are not tied to the district energy system, but are part of that campus level compliance application. Important things to note for tracking energy on a campus with the district energy system. We want to measure energy into the district energy system, not the energy produced and distributed by the district system. We need to account for all other energy consumption at the building level. So the district energy system is likely providing thermal energy through steam or hot water to buildings on the campus, but some of those buildings might have their own electricity meters that are fed directly into those buildings, right? So we want to capture that energy use, just not the metered energy coming into the building from the district energy system, because we don't want to duplicate or double count that energy usage. And then if metered appropriately, campuses may deduct energy exported for beneficial use from their gross energy consumption in order to calculate the EUI in accordance with the net energy use calculations outlined in section 5.2 of the standard. Next slide. All right, one more, thanks. So similar to the approach for tracking a campus's net energy use, you'll need to develop the EUIt based on the organization's approach to compliance with the Clean Building Standard. So, you know, campus in and of itself is not an approach to compliance. As Luke mentioned, they still need to comply with the performance metric of the Clean Building Standard. So depending on if they're complying at that connected building level or if they're complying at a campus level, that may look a little bit different. So at a minimum, EUIt must include all the buildings connected to the district energy system if they're doing that connected building compliance, and then must include buildings potentially outside of that district energy system connected building layout if they're connecting to that campus level compliance. In this example here, we've got kind of a breakdown of what that calculation might look like. So the campus EUIt should be developed using an area weighted average of targets developed at the individual building level first. And then, you know, that's weighted by the gross floor area of those buildings as a percentage of the whole aggregated campus gross floor area. And then again, sub-meter and exclude buildings without targets and exclude individually exempt buildings from the EUIt calculations. That's it for me, unless there's any specific questions. Dylan.
Donnie, it doesn't seem like there are any specific questions for you. Patrick did input in the chat that both agencies use ESPM for tracking and data sharing, and that is Energy Star Portfolio Manager.
All right, on to James, thanks.
All right, so I'm going to talk quickly about the reporting requirements for the decarbonization plan. Next slide, please. So the first step in this is a notification to Commerce. As I think we've already talked about here, that initial period was set at June 30th, 2024. However, we are allowing folks to submit their registration and opt-in forms all the way up until June 30th, 2025, which is a main decarbonization plan submittal date. Next slide, please. So the following here, this is a example of the smart sheet form for the opt-in and registrations. Please note that when you're filling this out, the intent is to use this for the entire campus and not one individual form by building. There is an Excel file example included in this that has data entry points for all of your individual buildings. Next slide, please. So one of the things that the decarbonization plan requirements have introduced are two new compliance forms. That's Form J and Form K. So Form J is basically a modified version of Form A. Form A is typically your building details form. Form J is your campus details form. So it includes a lot of the same criterion, but at a campus-wide level. Form K is your decarbonization plan outline, and that will include things like your decarbonization plan scope of work, details for the existing district energy system and campus layout, benchmarking data, proposed district energy system details, and other data points that are all outlined in Annex W. Also, as you look at this, there's Form D and Form F are included. Those are only applicable when individual buildings are using the investment criteria pathway. The exception of Form F has kind of another additional exception of Form F being required if you're looking at decommissioning your district energy system. Next slide, please. So June 30th, 2025, we're looking at submitting your final plan, and the list here shows the documents that should be included in that. Please note too that while this says submit final plan, like Luke mentioned earlier with the EMP and O&M, we recognize that the decarbonization plan may also change through the reporting cycles and progress reporting cycles. It will be kind of a living document as things come up. So, be aware that while this says final plan, we do understand that things may change. That just needs to be documented through the progress reporting stages. Next slide, please. So speaking of the progress reporting stages, the intent here during the progress reporting every 5 years is to indicate both progress and indicate anything that may have changed or will need to change going forward. The real key here is trying to highlight what may have changed from over the last 5 years. Next slide, please. So completion reporting. First thing to know is that there are no campus level exemptions. Any exemption applications would need to be submitted on a building by building basis for those buildings that are on the campus. The requirements for meeting the EUIt through decarbonization are similar to the building level meeting the EUIt pathway, with the exceptions of Form J, K, and potentially F. Once again, F being required if you're going through analyzing the potential decommissioning of the existing district energy system. And for campuses meeting the investment criteria through decarbonization, you must submit documentation verifying that the campus has implemented all the EEMs that meet the cost effectiveness criteria from normative Annex X. Note that the cost effectiveness criteria does not apply to the decarbonization of the district energy system. Therefore, that should not be included as an EEM in the analysis. Next slide, please. So this is a reporting cycle, and I know Luke kind of already hit on this a little bit, and it does show 2024 for Notify Commerce. And as we've said, you have up until June 30th, 2025, which also corresponds to the submission of the final plan. So we'll be taking applications up until that point. Following that, every 5 years following the submission of the final plan in 2025, decarbonization plans must be resubmitted by July 1st of that year. These progress reports should capture the implementation progress and note any changes to the decarbonization plan that have taken place since the last reporting period. Note that a campus with a district energy system providing only cooling, which is not decarbonize or heating systems, is required to submit completion reporting in lieu of progress reporting by July 1st, 2030. And finally, the final completion reports. So final completion reports indicating full implementation of the decarbonization plan and compliance with the standard should be submitted by July 1st, 2040, or the alternatively approved decarbonization plan completion date. As Luke mentioned, we may be approving longer periods for the actual final completion reporting. It's based on a project by project basis. All right, I think next, potentially moving over to Q&A unless there's some very specific questions.
Okay, let's move to the Q&A real quick. Dylan, questions do we have?
Yes, we've got a couple questions. I welcome whomever to chime in and answer them. First question, have there been discussions at Commerce regarding the conversion of fossil fuel systems to hydrogen? And then Kyle also added renewable natural gas as well.
Yeah, there has been no specific conversations about hydrogen through here at Commerce regarding this. As long as it's not a fossil fuel source of hydrogen, I imagine it could be acceptable. We'd have to hit us up with that specific question. We can respond to that in writing as well. As far as renewable natural gas, yeah, if it's a biogas, it's certainly not considered a fossil fuel. So those resources can be utilized and considered fossil fuel free, as long as they are truly a renewable natural gas, which is defined within Section 3 of these rules. More likely, especially in these decarbonization plans, it's likely to supplement your fuel, but not fully replace it. But there could be some projects I'm not aware of that can provide enough renewable natural gas to meet those demands.
Perfect. Lyle also asks for campus level compliance for systems that have both connected and non-connected DES buildings. Are all of those buildings at the campus expected to comply on the 15-year timeline for campus level EUIT?
Yeah, so I think I understand the question, but please correct me if I don't hit it on the mark. So there are, through the rulemaking, 1390 rulemaking, we were able to amend the original Clean Building Performance Standard rules to include what we call a campus level compliance pathway, and that's available for a few building activity types called universities, K-12 schools, hospitals, and prisons. So if you have a district energy system on one of those traditionally defined campuses, you can comply through the decarbonization plan, including even buildings that are not connected to that district energy system. In those cases, let's give an example. A penitentiary that has 7 of their 9 buildings connected to the district energy system. They can comply and they're required, let's say if they've got over 100,000 aggregate square feet, they're required to do a decarbonization plan and comply through that pathway. They can add those other 2 buildings to that performance metric compliance and the other EMP and O&M requirements, and add that to the timeline associated with decarbonization of the district energy system. Commerce understands that the real big reason why this legislation came along was the legislative desire to focus investments in decarbonizing the heating plant when a district energy system is employed to serve buildings. So yes, you can do that for those 4 occupancies, include buildings that are not attached to that district energy system, and utilize that expanded timeline.
All right. Next question here is from Patrick, and it's concerning coordination between the Department of Enterprise Services and the Clean Buildings Performance Standard. A couple of the questions are, will there be future coordination between DES and Commerce regarding their, it looks like Patrick specifically is referencing the energy use report that he had to submit. And
yeah, I think I understand this question as well. There's, as DES has benchmarking requirements, and they do allow a campus level benchmarking reporting where they may require it. This is part of their benchmarking legislation, I think goes back to 2010. Their definition of campus is broader than the Clean Buildings Performance Standards definition of campus. Unfortunately, we can't change the definition of campus within the Clean Building Performance Standard because it was legislatively derived. And I do understand the confusion where in the Clean Building Performance Standard, we define campus as buildings connected to a district energy system, and it doesn't go so broad as what we generally define a campus as, whether it's a college campus or a business park or the state capitol campus, right? Unfortunately, we can't, unless DES and that legislation that DES is implementing and enforcing changes, we're not going to get that coordination. But we are continually communicating with other public laws that may touch the fabric of the Clean Building Performance Standard and trying to coordinate some consistencies. That's not always possible.
All right. Next question here is from Jeanette. Since it's one EMP and O&M, Jeanette's asking, based on the initial due dates, do they have to comply based on the largest building, or would it be compliance for yeah, what's the timeline compliance date based on their campus?
So
Or,
what
sorry,
we
their
would
area.
we would expect that energy management plan and O&M program to be an iterative process. So come 2026, you will have the EMP and O&M developed for at minimum those largest of buildings. 2027, you'll include that next cohort of buildings, which includes tier 2 buildings, and by 2028, you'll have all tier 1 and tier 2 buildings included in that single EMP and O&M. And then by 2030, it will include all buildings connected to the district energy system.
All right, somewhat follow-up question from Norm. Norm just wants to clarify that that's an incremental implementation of ENP/O&M. And then Norm also just inputs that the size of the building is not the best metric. I don't think the rest of this is a question, but I do invite people to read it in the chat if they have more questions on this topic.
Yeah, it's the question doesn't need to necessarily be answered here, Luke, but I just wanted to get it broadly advertised that I intend to create an EMP and an O&M plan that will show compliance for 2026. I just keep getting caught in my craw, this idea that it needs to be focused on building by building implementation, which is not the way district energy systems work. A lot of our priorities are at the central plant that affect all building energy EUIs. And those are strategic in that the improvements at the central plant are most impactful and create the most efficiency gains at the district level. So just want to keep reiterating that we will try to adhere as best as we can to the idea of building size being prioritized, but it may not always be possible.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying, Norman. I will say that the intent of the schedule is to get folks moving on that EMP and O&M and affecting square footage by those compliance dates originally scheduled. If within the decarbonization plan, there's a schedule plan for implementing the EMP and O&M program, prioritizing energy savings that essentially meets the intent here, I'm sure that would be reasonable for Commerce to accept that.
Right. I've thought about the idea of, square footage of the campus by building size. If it broke out 20% across 5 different building size groupings, that if we get 20% of the EMP and O&M implemented each year, 2026 through 2030, is that equivalent of compliance?
Yeah, and that likely would be, I can't really answer you for officially right now, but we can have that conversation. If for other folks on the call, if you get those ideas too, it seems reasonable to me.
Yeah, just wanted to get the idea out there early so you're not surprised.
Yep.
All right, next question here from Doug. Are there special rules for heat-based cooling? For example, absorption cooling.
Yeah, we don't have any special rules. We want the experts in decarbonization of district energy systems to come up with the most cost-effective, most energy-saving plans in decarbonizing. So we don't want to quell any innovative efforts that are proven. Hopefully that answers the question.
I think so. Next question from Jeff. Will Commerce develop templates or sample plans? Jeff also adds that having an example of a compliant decarb plan would be very helpful.
Yeah, I don't know if anybody else from our team can answer this in more detail, but yeah, we have gotten that request and we understand the value of that. There are entities within the state that have already produced some significant decarbonization plans for the campuses, not necessarily in line or designed with these rules in mind because they were designed prior, but I think they meet the majority, if not all, of the decarbonization plan. So we can certainly look for some examples to publish. Team, is there anything else you want to add to that? I think we do have some. Adeline, do we have something posted online already?
We don't have anything posted online, but the I believe it's called ideas. I don't know what, I forgot what ideas stand for. And we'll cover this in part 2. There are some case studies out there for district energy systems that's very helpful in their website. Also, the University of Colorado, or maybe it's Denver University, I'm not quite sure the actual, we'll share that again in our future training for some resources that they take into account the EUIt reduction in their EUI in their Decarb plan. So that's something that's that we have out that's already kind of in place, and they're in progress of implementing. As you know, a Decarb plan is over the course of several years and over time. So it's really difficult to have something, oh, here it is, and this would comply. So, but that's what we can offer, is what's in progress now and what's kind of pretty similar to what we have aligned with the requirements.
Thank you, Annalyn. Next question here, following up on Luke's example of penitentiary. Would the buildings not connected to the district energy system be required to have a plan to decarbonize the individual building?
Yeah, not through this legislation. So through House Bill 1390, there are no requirements for decarbonizing beyond the district energy systems. So any building not connected would not need to. I believe some state buildings have some decarbonizing legislation out there beyond the clean buildings. Heard rumor of that. I just don't remember the details. There may be in some specific cases for state-owned buildings.
All right, next question here from Jeanette is, Jeanette, please, if I get this question wrong, please feel free to unmute yourself to ask it. But Jeanette's asking if colleges and universities can use the college/university EUIt of 102 with shift normalization, specifically referencing that table 7-3. Judy answered this a little bit in the chat, but Jeanette, if you have a more specific question, I welcome you to unmute yourself.
Sure, thanks. Yeah, you were showing how to calculate an EUIt, and I'm just confirming, I believe what we've talked about before is that college and universities have an EUIt that's comprehensive, and that's what we plan to continue. There's also reporting at the campus level, as Judah said, but that's actually a little different than my question or confirmation.
Yeah, so the EUIt can be, before college universities, should be utilized for college universities for the district energy system decarbonization, or if they go beyond to the campus level compliance pathway or connected building pathway, they can use that. They can do a disaggregate or an area weighted energy use intensity target if they do have buildings at the campus level that do not fit the definition of college university provided in table 7-4, which are based off of Energy Star portfolio managers' definitions of building property types. For example, we do have a footnote in there table 7-2A that says if a laboratory on a college campus is more of a research laboratory. I know UW and some other universities, I'm sure many of the major universities in the state have research laboratories. They're not typical classroom laboratories. Research laboratories have quite a high energy use intensity. In those cases, they can disaggregate that research laboratory gross floor area and do an area-weighted campus-wide energy use intensity target calculation, including that higher target for that research library or research laboratory GFA.
Thanks, Luke. Okay, we're about time. I just want to get through the next few slides. So part 2, here's kind of our agenda for right now. If there's topics you'd like to cover, please, we'll stay on for a little bit. Please enter it in the chat, or you can email us at buildings@commerce.wa.gov. We'll also talk about some resources and some case studies out there that take into account not just decarbonization of their district energy systems, but reduction of energy use and with it. And then and if you have some scenario that you have and you'd want us to kind of focus on that, we can use it as an example, but go ahead and put it in the chat. Next slide, please. And then here are the upcoming events. So between now and part 2, the August 22nd district energy system decarbonization plan, that part, we are going to be talking about tier 2 incentives. We're specifically about funding distribution on August 15th. We hope you could join us. And that's going to talk about more of the equity piece of it and who is authorized for enhanced incentive and who should we consider. I believe Judy is putting all the links in the chat if you want to register. And then every 4th Tuesday of the month, we're starting office hours. So one month it may be specifically on district energy, or if you have a random questions on something else, or just want to hang out. We'll be sitting in silence if no one shows up. Either way, thank you so much for joining us. Next slide, please. We will see you next time around. We appreciate you joining us today. Have a great day.